May 6, 1945. Pilsen, western Czechoslovakia. American armor entered the city through streets that had waited 6 years for that sound. The engines came first, then the men on the sidewalks. People ran out before the shooting had fully ended. Some carried flags that had been hidden since 1939. Some climbed onto the tanks and kissed the dust on the armor. Others stood in doorways, unable to move, watching uniforms they had never seen in their own streets. German troops were still inside Pilsen. There was firing from buildings. The cathedral tower became a position. A city can be liberated in the morning and still be dangerous at noon. The Americans knew that. So did the people coming out to meet them. The men in the tanks belonged to George S. Patton's Third Army. For months, that name had meant motion. Normandy to Brittany, Lorraine to the Ardennes, the Rhine to Germany, Germany to the Czech border. Patton's army had crossed rivers, burned fuel, outrun supply maps, and forced German commanders to make decisions with no time left for comfort. Now it was in Pilsen. Prague lay to the east. The capital was rising against the Germans, while Patton's lead units sat within reach of the road. Czech radio called for help. Barricades went up. German guns still fired. Civilians who had lived under occupation since before America entered the war were asking for soldiers, any soldiers, to arrive before the Germans crushed them. Patton wanted to go. Eisenhower said no. The line had already been agreed. Western Czechoslovakia would be held by the Americans. Prague would be taken by the Red Army. There would be no final armored race by Patton into the capital. No photograph of the general arriving in Prague. No American flag over that last city of the European war. Patton obeyed the order. He did not like it. He did not hide that. Men who knew him understood how much the stop cost him. A road still open was almost an insult to Patton. Open ground asked to be used. A moving enemy asked to be broken. A city under fire asked to be reached. The Supreme Commander saw a different war on the same map. Dwight Eisenhower had armies converging from the west and east, Soviet columns driving into Bohemia, German units trying to surrender to the Americans, and agreements with Moscow that had to survive the final days. A clash between American and Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia, even by mistake, could stain the victory before it was complete. So Patton stopped. That stop did not save Germany. It did change who entered Prague. It left one of the war's bitter questions behind in western Bohemia. It gave Patton one more order to resent, and Eisenhower one more decision that had to be measured beyond the horizon of the battlefield. To understand what Patton did when Eisenhower stopped him, the story has to begin before Pilsen, before Prague, before the surrender. It begins on a river in central Germany. When Patton first reached the edge of a road he was not allowed to take. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. April 12, 1945. The Third Army was moving through Germany with a pace that made staff work look old before the ink dried. Town names shifted across situation maps by the hour. German units that had survived one American contact found another American column ahead of them the next morning. Patton liked that kind of war. He believed speed attacked the mind before it attacked the body. If a German commander had time to count his guns, pull back his infantry, mind the roads, and call artillery onto the approaches, then every mile cost more men. If that same commander lost bridges, phone line, fuel, and headquarters in quick succession, he stopped commanding an army and started chasing fragments. Patton's Third Army had become good at creating fragments. It had gone operational in Normandy in August 1944. By the time spring arrived, its record had already become part of the Allied advance. Brittany, Lorraine, the relief of Bastogne, the crossing of the Rhine, and the thrust into the heart of Germany. The men were exhausted, but they were used to the pressure. Their supply officers cursed it. Their tank crews lived inside it. By early April, the army was pointing toward the Mo River. Beyond the Mulde stood Chemnitz. Beyond Chemnitz, the map pulled the eye toward Dresden and the wider road into the eastern half of the Reich. Soviet forces were coming from the other direction. Somewhere ahead, the two Allied fronts would meet. That was the danger. The war was shrinking. Armies that had once been separated by whole countries were now entering the same road network. Refugees jammed the highways. German soldiers moved in both directions, some still fighting, others looking for a Western unit to surrender to. The Luftwaffe was broken, but small attacks could still happen. Waffen-SS units still held pockets. Bridges were blown and rebuilt under pressure. Maps were wrong. Radios failed. An American tank column and a Soviet spearhead did not have to hate each other to start firing. Bad visibility, bad intelligence, a nervous lieutenant at a bridge, a German trick, one burst in the wrong tree line could become a diplomatic injury that no general wanted in the final week of the war. Eisenhower stopped Patton at the Mulde. The order placed the Third Army about 10 miles short of Chemnitz. To Patton, it must have felt like a hand on the throat of the offensive. His army was still capable of attack. The enemy in front of him was breaking. Every lesson in his body told him that the proper answer was to keep going. Patton had no authority to make that decision. He could argue. He could write. He could complain to men who had heard him complain before. He could look at the map and see places that would have fallen if he had been given another day. He could not take the Third Army across the line in defiance of Eisenhower. So the army halted. The tanks pulled up. Reconnaissance stayed active. Units consolidated. Engineers worked. Prisoners came in. The front did not become peaceful because an order used the word halt. A stopped army still has to guard roads, clear houses, gather intelligence, control civilians, process prisoners, and prepare for the next order. Patton waited for that next order with the impatience of a man whose talent was being held in place. Berlin was also in the air. Some leaders still wanted the Western Allies to take it if they could. The city mattered to memory. Capitals always do. Berlin had been the seat of Hitler's government, the origin point of so many orders that had torn Europe apart. For a soldier who had fought from France into Germany, the idea of stopping while another army took Berlin could feel wrong in the bones. Eisenhower did not treat Berlin as the final military prize. The city was deep in the Soviet occupation zone, already agreed among the Allies. A Western assault would cost lives for ground that would have to be handed over. Soviet forces were closer and already committed. Eisenhower also feared that Germany's remaining organized danger might be forming in the south, in Bavaria and Austria, where rumors of an Alpine redoubt still had weight in Allied intelligence. Patton was stopped in the east. Then Eisenhower gave him a new direction. Southeast, toward the Danube, toward Bavaria, toward Austria, toward Linz and Salzburg. If German resistance tried to survive in the mountains, Patton's army would help close the door. Patton had lost the road to Chemnitz. He did not lose the war of movement. A large army does not turn because a general points at a map. The Third Army had corps, divisions, artillery groups, engineer battalions, medical units, tank destroyers, signal teams, quartermasters, military police, field kitchens, repair shops, and truck companies stretched across Germany. Its strength was motion, but motion required coordination. Roads had to be assigned. Bridges had to be checked. Fuel had to be redirected. Ammunition dumps had to move. Units already in contact needed orders that made sense to men who could hear German guns while headquarters spoke of new axes. Patton understood the machinery better than his public image suggests. He loved speed, but he knew speed had to be fed. A tank without gasoline becomes a pillbox. A rifle company without cartridges becomes a rumor. An artillery battalion without shells becomes a line of parked guns. So the army shifted. The drive southeast carried Patton to the last large spaces of southern Germany still available to him. Towns surrendered with white sheets and windows. Other places made the Americans pay for each street. German officers alternated between brittle pride and practical fear. Some had orders to hold. Some had no orders at all. Some destroyed their papers and tried to look like ordinary men. The war had reached a stage where surrender often moved faster than combat. American columns would enter a town and find German soldiers waiting in courtyards with weapons stacked nearby. In another town, a machine gun might fire until a tank shell ended the argument. A few miles beyond that, a mayor might stand in the road with a white cloth tied to a stick. There was no single German army now, at least not in the way soldiers had understood that phrase in 1940 or 1941, there were formations with names, units with officers, groups of men still dangerous, and scattered pieces trying to survive. The uniform remained. The structure beneath it was breaking. Patton kept pressure on the fracture points. His units crossed the Danube. Regensburg fell. Passau came into the field of operations. The road system angled toward Austria. Bridges mattered more than speeches. Every intact crossing saved hours. Every blown bridge gave engineers another hard job at the edge of tiredness. Behind the spearheads, the human weight of Germany's collapse pressed against the army. Prisoners came in by the thousands. Displaced persons appeared from camps, factories, farms, and roads. Forced laborers who had been dragged into Germany from across Europe now moved through the same towns as American trucks. Civilians feared bombing, revenge, hunger, Soviet troops, SS holdouts, and the unknown. The victorious army became a moving authority before it had time to become an occupation force. Patton's front was no longer only a line of battle. It was a sieve catching the end of state. On April 4th, 3rd Army troops reached Ohrdruf, a forced labor camp connected to Buchenwald. The soldiers saw bodies, starvation, and the remains of murder carried out under official order. Patton came. Eisenhower came. Bradley came. They looked at the evidence themselves. After that, every argument about the war had a different weight. Men who had already lost friends now had proof of what Nazi power meant when it controlled a place with no outside witness. Camps had names. The dead had bodies. The crimes were no longer reports filtered through intelligence channels or rumors from refugees. They were in front of American soldiers, close enough to smell. The 3rd Army kept moving after Ohrdruf, but the men carried that knowledge forward. In late April, the map changed again. American and Soviet troops met near Torgau on the Elbe on April 25th. The image would become one of the famous pictures of the war. Soldiers from opposite sides of Europe clasping hands over a defeated Germany. The meeting showed what was already true. The Reich had been cut in two. In Berlin, the Soviets were fighting toward the center. In Bavaria, American troops moved through the old symbolic heart of the Nazi movement. Munich fell on April 30th, the same day Hitler killed himself in his bunker. The coincidence was brutal and exact. The city where the movement had grown fell while the man who led it ended his life underground. Yet the war did not stop that day. Germany still had a government of sorts under Admiral Karl Donitz. German armies still occupied ground. Units still fought in Czechoslovakia, Austria, Denmark, Norway, and elsewhere. Papers still had to be signed. Orders still had to reach men who might obey, ignore, or never receive them. Donitz wanted time. His aim was clear enough. Hold the East long enough for German troops and civilians to move west. Surrender to the British and Americans where possible. Avoid Soviet captivity if any road remains open. It was not a plan to win the war. It was a plan to choose a jailer. Patton's army stood along some of the roads men were trying to reach. That made his halted lines powerful in a way that did not resemble a charge. A moving 3rd Army could take cities. A stopped 3rd Army could receive the collapse of German formations seeking the West. Early May made ordinary military language feel too small. Battalions surrendered, then regiments, then mixed groups with no clear parent formation. Officers appeared with pistols still polished and faces gone gray from lack of sleep. Trucks arrived packed with men who had once marched east under banners and now wanted an American guard to write down their names. Some German soldiers looked relieved. Others looked insulted by survival. The SS remained a danger no one could ignore. Some units fought on because they had reason to fear what surrender would expose. Some tried to disappear before anyone could ask where they had served. Military police, intelligence officers, and ordinary infantrymen learned to look at boots, tattoos, papers, accents, and the nervous habits of men pretending to be something else. The Americans had to sort victory, while victory was still moving. Weapons were collected. Vehicles were counted. Roads were cleared. Prisoners were marched into fields, then larger enclosures, then temporary camps that filled faster than planners could organize them. Food became a military problem. So did sanitation. So did disease. So did revenge. A destroyed state leaves paperwork behind, but the paperwork arrives late. The first reality is bodies on roads. Families pulling carts, prisoners with hands raised, and local officials insisting they had never really believed in the regime whose portraits still hung inside their offices. Patton had little patience for excuses. He was at his best when the task was direct. Move, strike, cross, surround, take. May force different tasks onto him. Take the surrender. Hold the line. Feed the liberated. Control the defeated. Keep soldiers disciplined. Stop traffic from choking the roads. Watch the Soviet boundary. Watch the Germans. Watch the civilians. A battlefield commander had to become the edge of an occupation government. The Third Army's record by the end of the war was enormous. It had traveled farther than any other American army in Europe, pushed as far east as Pilsen and South to Linz, and captured more than 1.25 million prisoners by the time hostilities ended. Those numbers can become flat on a page. On the ground, they meant fields full of men waiting to be processed, stacks of rifles, miles of vehicles, and guards try to understand how a war could end by producing so many captives at once. The German soldiers' calculation in those days was often simple. West meant a better chance to live. East meant fear. That fear did not erase what Germany had done in the Soviet Union. It was born from the knowledge of it. Men who had served in the East understood why the Red Army might not arrive with mercy in its hands. Civilians had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, all powerful enough to move crowds. So they moved west. Patton's lines became a destination. The same army that had been ordered to stop could still shape events by where it stood. If German troops could reach Americans, they surrendered. If they could not, they faced the Soviets or kept running until the war caught them. This mattered in Czechoslovakia. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner's army group center still held large forces in Bohemia and Moravia. Schorner had a reputation for hardness that reached his own men first. He demanded discipline when discipline had lost its purpose. He pushed units to hold while the Reich that gave him authority had already lost Berlin. His army group became one of the last large German formations still trying to exist after the center of the war had collapsed. Prague sat inside that final confusion. To the west, Patton's units moved toward Pilsen. To the east and north, Soviet armies prepared the offensive that would enter the capital. Between them were German commanders trying to preserve routes, Czech civilians risking open revolt, and Allied boundaries that had been settled before the last shots. Patton could feel the opportunity. A commander who moves fast learns to sense an enemy's loss of balance. By May 1945, Germany had little balance left. Patton's instincts told him that Prague could be reached. His army had done harder things under worse conditions. Eisenhower saw the cost of acting outside the agreement. The Western Allies did not fight their way across Europe to stumble into an armed misunderstanding with the Soviets during Surrender Week. The Supreme Commander had to think about prisoners, occupation zones, surrender procedures, Allied unity, and the fact that millions of soldiers still carried loaded weapons. Patton wanted the road. Eisenhower held the line. The final days would test which mattered more. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Czechoslovakia had been waiting since 1939. The occupation had begun before the wider war became what the world now remembers. German pressure, the destruction of Czechoslovak independence, the protectorate, arrests, executions, forced labor, informers, fear, and the slow grinding down of public life had all arrived long before American troops crossed the Rhine. By May 1945, the people of Western Bohemia knew the Germans were losing. Knowing that can be dangerous. An occupier in retreat still has rifles. A regime in its last week can kill with the same bullet it used in its first year. A crowd that rises too soon may pay for a liberation that is still miles away. On May 5th, Pilsen rose. People went into the streets. Nazi symbols came down. Local resistance challenged German control before the Americans had fully entered. The city was gambling on distance and time. If Patton's men arrived quickly, the uprising would become liberation. If they came late, the Germans could punish the city before surrender became unavoidable. The Americans were already moving. The 16th Armored Division was given a chance to enter the war at its very end and still leave a name behind. Combat Command be drove into Pilsen on May 6. The 2nd Infantry Division and 97th Infantry Division were also part of the American presence in the region. The streets received them with a force that soldiers remember for the rest of their lives. A liberation is a military event for the Army. For the city, it is a return of breath. People touched vehicles. They offered flowers, drink, food, thanks, and whatever English words they knew. Some had learned enough to say hello. Others needed no language. They waved. They wept. They held children up to see the soldiers. They pulled Americans into embraces before the Americans knew their names. There was still danger. German resistance inside Pilsen did not end at the first sight of American armor. Shots came from the cathedral tower. Other positions had to be handled. German General George von Maevsky surrendered the city, and organized resistance ended. That surrender closed 6 years of occupation in Pilsen. The Americans had arrived. Patton's army had crossed the last border of its war. For many of his soldiers, Pilsen became a memory unlike the German towns they had passed. The welcome was open and immediate. In Germany, white flags often meant fear, calculation, or exhaustion. In Pilsen, the cheers came from people who had no reason to pretend gratitude to the men liberating them. That difference mattered. A soldier can spend months moving through places that hate him, fear him, need him, or blame him for the destruction around them. Then he enters a city where strangers climb onto his vehicle and call him liberator. That moment stays. Patton came into the city after the leading units. He saw the crowds. He saw what his army had done in the little space still allowed to it. The general who had wanted Prague had, at least, Pilsen. It was not a consolation prize to the people who lived there. It was their liberation. The city never forgot. That matters because memory in Czechoslovakia would soon become control ground. After 1948, when the communist regime took power, public gratitude to the American army became inconvenient. The official story had little room for Patton's tanks in Pilsen. The Soviet liberation narrative dominated public life. Families kept other memories inside homes, photographs, and private speech. After 1989, Pilsen could speak openly again. The city honored the Americans. Veterans returned when they could. Jeeps, half-tracks, flags, and ceremonies re-entered the streets. People who had been children in 1945 stood as old men and women, while a new generation learned why May 6 meant something different in Western Bohemia. On the day itself, none of that future was visible. There was only the city, the tanks, the last scattered shooting, and the road east. Prague was calling. Prague's uprising began on May 5th. The city was full of German forces, Czech resistance fighters, civilians, barricades, rumors, and fear. Radio Prague called for help. The voice on the air was urgent because the danger was immediate. German units still had armor, artillery, and enough discipline in places to kill many people before anyone could stop them. Patton wanted permission to advance. He had the temperament for that answer. He had the troops near enough to imagine the move. Pilsen had fallen. German resistance was fractured. The map tempted him with one last arrow. The answer from Eisenhower remained no. The demarcation line was not a suggestion. It was an arrangement between allies whose armies were already close enough to collide. Prague lay beyond the American limit. Soviet forces were moving toward the city. Eisenhower would not send Patton into a position where American and Soviet units might meet in confusion during the final hours of the German surrender. Patton's anger was real. So was his obedience. This is where the popular picture of him often becomes too simple. Patton's language could be reckless. His pride could outrun his judgment. He made enemies in uniforms that should have been friendly to him. He said things that damaged his own career. Yet in Czechoslovakia, at the edge of Prague, he did not create a private campaign. He held his army. That restraint should be part of the story. Disobedience and victory can still kill men. If Patton had pushed beyond the line and met Soviet forward units under unclear conditions, the first gunfire would have become more than a tactical accident. Reports would move upward. Moscow would read motive into movement. Washington and London would ask what happened. Eisenhower would have to explain why a field army had crossed a boundary in the final hours of a war already ending. Patton might have taken Prague faster. He also might have created a crisis before the German surrender was complete. The people inside Prague had no reason to care about staff agreements while shells were falling. A civilian under fire measures rescue by minutes, not by conferences. That is the human wound in this decision. Eisenhower's reasoning can be understood without making the suffering in Prague smaller. The Red Army entered Prague on May 9th. By then, Germany had signed at Reims on May 7th. The surrender took effect on May 8th in the West and May 9th by Moscow time. The timing left Prague in the strange space between formal defeat and local violence. A government can surrender while armed men continue to shoot. A radio can announce the end while a barricade still waits for help. Patton's soldiers remained where ordered. They secured Western Bohemia. They received German prisoners. They watched the East with the impatience of men who believed they could still move. Some would carry the thought for the rest of their lives. If the order had been different, they might have entered Prague. History cannot rear on the road. It can only hold the cost of the road taken. For Prague, liberation came with Soviet tanks. For Pilsen, liberation came with American tanks. The difference shaped memory for decades. One city became central to the Soviet story of Czechoslovakia's liberation. The other kept alive a Western memory that politics later tried to narrow, then silence. Patton had reached the limit of military talent. A general can move faster than expected. He can read weakness in an enemy line. He can terrify defenders and inspire his own troops. He can turn an army 90 degrees in winter, cross rivers, take cities, and break formations larger than his own league units. He cannot outrank the settlement of the war. By May 1945, decisions made at higher levels had more power over Prague than Patton's tanks did. The Western Allies and the Soviets were already dividing the military responsibilities of the final advance. The occupation zones were taking shape. The post-war world was entering the room before the war had fully left it. Patton sensed that world and hated it. He distrusted the Soviets more openly than many around him wanted to hear. He believed the Western Allies were giving up ground that should have been held. Some of his later comments would become part of the trouble that followed him after victory. In May, his frustration centered on something concrete. A city he could see on the map and was not allowed to reach. Still, he stopped. At the Mulde, he had been redirected. At Pilsen, he was fixed in place. The second order hurt more because there was no new road offered as replacement. There was only the line, the prisoners, the liberated city behind him, the unentered capital ahead of him, and the knowledge that the war was ending without the final scene he wanted. Patton's halt did not leave Germany alive. By the time his tank stopped outside the road to Prague, the Reich had already lost the elements that make a state able to continue war. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Ruhr had been captured. The Rhine had been crossed. The air war had ruined the cities and transport system. German fuel was gone. Units in the field still had weapons, but weapons do not make strategy when the government behind them has become a bunker, a signature, and a few desperate radio messages. The German surrender at Reims on May 7th put into writing what the battlefield had already made plain. Donitz could delay. He could try to send troops west. He could hope to save men from the Soviets by sacrificing time and discipline. He could not rebuild the Wehrmacht. He could not restore the Luftwaffe. He could not reopen rail lines, replace fuel stocks, reverse the Soviet capture of Berlin, or push American armies back across the Rhine. A stop Patton was still part of the ending. His army held ground that mattered. It stood in western Czechoslovakia and southern Germany as a receiving line for surrendering formations. It blocked routes. It controlled cities. It helped seal Austria and Bavaria. It forced German soldiers to choose captivity over continued movement. The war ended because every major German choice had narrowed to surrender, flight, or pointless death. Local commanders could still kill. Schorner's formations could still move. SS units could still refuse reality. German troops could still fire at civilians and Allied soldiers. That violence mattered to the people who suffered it. It did not change the outcome. That is the hard difference between danger and power. Germany remained dangerous in May 1945. It no longer had the power to win, bargain from strength, or shape the end on its own terms. Eisenhower's stop order has to be judged inside that fact. If Patton had gone to Prague, Germany would still have surrendered. If Patton had remained at Pilsen, Germany still surrendered. The question left behind is not whether the Reich survived because Patton stopped. It did not. The question is who paid for the hours between the order and the Red Army's arrival, and how the memory of those hours was used afterward. Patton paid in pride. Prague paid in fear and blood. Pilsen received the liberation Patton was allowed to give. Eisenhower carried the responsibility for a larger settlement that many people on the ground could not see and had no reason to love. His choice avoided an Allied collision at the end of the war. It also left Americans watching a city call for help beyond a line they could not cross. There is no clean victory in that kind of order. Patton's post-war life was short. He became military governor in Bavaria, a role that fit him poorly. The war had rewarded his speed, aggression, and hunger for decision. Occupation demanded patience, political care, denazification, civilian administration, and disciplined speech in front of reporters. Patton's words, always dangerous, became more damaging after the guns stopped. He was removed from command of the Third Army later in 1945. In December, he was badly injured in a car accident in Germany. He died on December 21st, 1945, in Heidelberg. The general who had spent so much of his life preparing for battle did not live long enough to watch the full shape of the Cold War form around the decisions he had argued against. His last campaign remained tied to Western Czechoslovakia. Pilsen remembered him. Prague remembered another army. Europe remembered the surrender. Soldiers remembered roads, towns, prisoners, and the feeling of being stopped when the enemy still seemed within reach. That is what Patton did when Eisenhower ordered him to stop. He obeyed. Before the final stop, he turned where ordered and kept breaking German resistance. At the final stop, he held the line, secured Pilsen, took prisoners, and watched the German war finish itself against Allied power on every side. He wanted one more advance. Eisenhower wanted the surrender completed without an Allied rupture. Both men got part of what they wanted. Neither got a perfect ending. On May 6th, Pilsen heard American engines. On May 7th, Germany signed at Reims. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended for the Western Allies. On May 9th, Prague saw Soviet tanks. Patton's army remained where it had been told to remain. The road east stayed closed. The war ended anyway. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.